السلام عليكم أعزائي الطلبة. المحاضرة الثانية about hemopoiesis, erythropoiesis, structure and function of the erythrocytes. بالمحاضرة السابقة حكينا عن ال sites of the production of the hemopoietic cells, the bone marrow structure, and we talked about the erythrocytes specifically, how they are produced in the bone marrow. Now we will continue with the function of the red blood cells. Mainly the red blood cells' function is for carrying oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. Without the red blood cells, oxygen cannot reach to any cells in the body. And this function is mainly carried by hemoglobin that's present inside the red blood cells. Also, the red blood cell is required for transporting enormous quantities of CO2 in the form of bicarbonate from the tissues to the lungs, where it's reconverted back to CO2 and expelled through expiration. إذن هي مهمة في عملية التبادل الغازي، حمل الأكسجين من lungs to the tissues, and this is achieved by hemoglobin carrying CO2 from the tissues to the lung to be in the form of bicarbonate to be reconverted in the lung into CO2 and then expelled out from the body through the process of expiration. Also, the hemoglobin has an important function as an acid-base buffer responsible for the buffering power of the blood. Then hide the major three important functions for the red blood cells. Now, احنا قلنا the process of the regulation of the formation of new red blood cells in the bone marrow starts from the proerythroblast اللي هي تكون ناتجة عن stem cells وهي تعتبر the earliest precursor of the red blood cells, and this proerythroblast is going to pass into intermediate forms until it finally becomes mature red blood cells. And in this line of differentiation, as we said previously, we have two important things that happens together. The cells are going to accumulate more and more hemoglobin until reaching the final concentration of hemoglobin inside the cell, and the size of the nucleus of the cell is going to get smaller and smaller until in the final stage it will be extruded out of the cell, and the cell will convert into what we call the reticulocyte that contain remnants of RNA and gets out of the bone marrow to the blood, circulate for 1 or 2 days, and then transform into mature cell. High process of erythropoiesis or forming new red blood cells, it should be regulated within a narrow limit. ليش within a narrow limit؟ لأن احنا نحتاج red blood cells for transporting oxygen to the tissue, but at the same time we don't want high amount of red blood cells, as this is going to increase the blood viscosity and cause obstruction in the blood vessels. إذا أنا لازم عندي ليميت محدد ما أزيد عنه بالred blood cells، لأنه إذا زادت هذا حيزيد لزوجة الدم، ممكن يسبب لي مشاكل بالسيركوليشن ويسوي لي slow circulation. شو الأشياء اللي نحتاجها على مود أو تأثر على production of the red blood cells? The regulation depends mainly on three important factors. طبعا هي مرتبطة واحدة بالثانية. Tissue oxygenation is the most important regulator of red blood cell production. يعني إذا أي decrease يصير عندي in the tissue oxygenation especially of the kidney، وهسه راح نعرف ليش. Any condition that decrease the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue is going to send a stimulus to the bone marrow to increase the red blood cell production، لأنه الجسم يحس أنا صار عندي نقص بتسليم الأكسجين للتشو، يدز رأسا الإيعاز إلى نخاع العظم بزيادة إنتاج the red blood cells. شنو ممكن يسبب لي reduction in the tissue oxygenation؟ Many different factors ممكن تسبب هذا الشيء. For example, decreased oxygen in the atmosphere, dysfunction of the respiratory system, problem in the respiratory system, problem in the heart, in the circulation, bleeding. For example, I'm losing red blood cells, I'm losing blood. anemia اللي راح نعرف بعدين شنو معناتها من ينقص عندي كمية الهيموغلوبين inside my body. So the amount of oxygen delivered لأن احنا قلنا mainly is this is done by the hemoglobin. هذا راح يقلل كمية الأكسجين اللي واصل للتشو, so it will sense it and send the message to the bone marrow to increase red blood cell production. إذا هذا the most important regulator. شلون راح يسوي هذا؟ شلون راح يزيد عملية صناعة red blood cells؟ through erythropoietin. We have another important factor in the regulation اللي هو the presence of the elements that the body require in order to produce new red blood cells. So dietary factors that affect red blood cell production are also important regulator for its production. نجي على erythropoietin. What is erythropoietin? It's a hormone with a molecular or glycoprotein with a molecular weight of 34,000 kDa. 90% of the erythropoietin is being produced by the kidney, and the remaining 10% is produced by the liver. شنو الشيء اللي يحفز لي erythropoietin production؟ هذا المخطط هنا راح يوضح لنا. قلنا 90% هو synthesized by the kidney, and we have sensors in the kidney, oxygen sensors. So anything that causes decrease in oxygen delivery to the kidney tissue for any reason, whether it is in the low atmospheric O2, cardiac problem, pulmonary problem, decrease in the hemoglobin concentration, or even renal artery obstruction, so that the amount of the blood that reaches to the tissue is reduced, this is going to be sensed by those sensors, will result in increase in the erythropoietin production. And once it is increased, it's going to act on the bone marrow. وين راح يشتغل بالبون marrow؟ راح يشتغل على late forms of the line of differentiation of the erythroid series. يعني مو على stem cells، مو على early erythroblast، لا على late forms. يشتغل بحيث يزيد من عملية تصنيع the red blood cells, increase this pathway resulting in increasing the synthesis of red blood cells. Now, so hypoxia causes a marked increase in the erythropoietin production. At hypoxic states, erythropoietin production is increased within minutes to hours and reaches maximum within 24 hours. طبعا هو راح يصعد، قلنا خلال ساعات يصعد ويوصل maximum within 24 hours. But I don't expect to see new red blood cells in the peripheral circulation unless after about 5 days at least. ليش؟ لأنه red blood cells they require time for their synthesis. إذا نرجع نراجعها. Erythropoietin is the major hormone that regulates the production of the red blood cell. It is produced by the kidney tissue. In the kidney we have sensors for the oxygen delivery. Once it is reduced for any reason, whether cardiac, pulmonary, anemia, renal artery obstruction, decrease in oxygen in the atmosphere, whatever the reason that decreases the oxygen delivery to the renal tissue, will result in increased erythropoietin production. Once it is increased, it's going to act on the late forms of the erythroid series, causing increase in the red blood cell production. The increase in the erythropoietin starts within hours and reaches maximum within 24 hours, and the appearance of new red blood cells in the circulation in the form of reticulocyte will start to appear within about 5 days after erythropoietin stimulus. As we said previously, dietary factors, they are very also important regulators, because if you want to synthesize, you need a material to build new red blood cells. So we have certain factors that are essential for the production of red blood cells. أهم 3 من عندها هي الفيتامين B12, folic acid and iron. راح نشوفون يعني later on in the next lectures that B12 and folic acid are required for the DNA synthesis in the early stages of proliferation and differentiation of the red blood cells precursors when they have a nucleus. And iron is required for the hemoglobin synthesis, and deficiency of those factors is going to result in certain types of anemia. Now, we'll talk about the hemoglobin structure and function, as it is the main constituent of the red blood cells. لازم نعرف بالضبط شنو المكونات مالته، من شنو تركيبته، وشنو الوظيفة الرئيسية للهيموغلوبين. Normally, the concentration of hemoglobin in our blood is about in men 13 إلى 17 gram per deciliter, and in females 12 to 15 gram per deciliter. The production of the hemoglobin, as we said, it starts from the pro-erythroblast stage, من the earliest precursor of the red blood cells, and continue in the intermediate stages. حتى بالreticulocyte still a small amount can be produced because it has remnants of RNA, as we said previously. But as the cell becomes mature, تتحول إلى mature red blood cells, the synthesis will stop and the cell will depend on the preformed hemoglobin in its function. يعني تعتمد على ما هو موجود ومخزون بداخلها in order to perform its function. Now, the structure of hemoglobin, it consists of 4 hemogroups, and each hemogroup is attached to a globin chain. The hemogroup consists of a protoporphyrin ring with an iron atom in the center. إذا وين حيكون الأيرون موجود بالهيموغلوبين؟ موجود في وسط البروتوبورفارين رينج اللي هو شنو؟ الهيموجروب. وكل هيموجروب is attached to a side globin chain اللي هي sequence of amino acids. راح نشوف الشكل مالته على مود يكون واضح عندكم. This is a structure of hemoglobin molecule. هذا اللي تشوفوه الملتوي هو الجلوبين chain، وهذا الأخضر اللي بالوسط هو الهيموجروب with an iron atom in its center. So I have 4 hemogroups, and each hemogroup is attached to a globin chain. Each 2 globin chains are identical. طبعا تختلف باختلاف أنواع الهيموغلوبين مثل ما راح نشوف هسه. So, hemoglobin consists of 4 hemogroups, and each hemogroup is attached to a globin chain. Each hemogroup consisting of a protoporphyrin ring with an iron atom in the center. So, as I have 4 iron atoms, they are capable of binding to 4 oxygen molecules. يعني كل واحدة من الهيموغلوبين molecule is capable of binding to 8 oxygen atoms. Now, depending on the amino acid composition of the globin chain، احنا قلنا الجلوبين chain هو عبارة عن protein consisting of a sequence of amino acids. حسب التركيبة مالت الهيموغلوبين الجلوبين chain وأنواع الأمينو أسيد الموجودة بيها، I have different types of hemoglobin. راح يكون عندي أنواع من الهيموغلوبين. بالإمبريونيك لايف عندنا نوع يسموه إمبريونيك هيموغلوبين، هذا موجود خلال الأشهر الثلاثة أو الأربعة أو الخمسة الأولى من الانترايوترال لايف، بعدين وراها يستبدل بأنواع ثانية. النوع الثاني عندي هو الفيتال هيموغلوبين، هذا الموجود يكون قلنا من ال second trimester, third trimester, and also up to 4 to 6 months after birth يكون موجود بكميات كبيرة. and even in our adult life هسه بدمنا من نقيس الهيموغلوبين نعرف أنواعه، موجود still hemoglobin F but at very small quantities not exceeding 1 to 2% of the total types of hemoglobin. من ايش يتكون هذا النوع من الهيموغلوبين؟ مو احنا قلنا 2 chains راح تكون identical. احنا عندنا 4 chains. It consists of 2 alpha and 2 gamma chains. نسميها alpha and gamma chains. The predominant type in the adults in our body is what we call the adult hemoglobin or hemoglobin A. هذا يكون موجود بكميات جدا قليلة after birth, but its production continues to increase gradually, so that after 1 year it becomes the major type of hemoglobin in our body. من ايش يتكون هذا؟ من 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. إذا عندي hemoglobin F 2 alpha 2 gamma, the adult hemoglobin 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. أكو نوع ثالث هو موجود بجسمنا بكميات قليلة اللي يسموه hemoglobin A2, not exceeds 3 to 5.5% of the total types of hemoglobin, وهذا يتكون من 2 alpha and 2 delta chains. 2 alpha and 2 delta chains. So these are the major types of the normal types of hemoglobin that are present in our body. As an adult, the predominant type will be hemoglobin A, the adult hemoglobin that consists of 2 alpha 2 beta chains، وعندي بعد وياه يجي ورا بالدرجة الثانية منه hemoglobin A2، هذا تكون نسبته قليلة ما تتجاوز 3.5%، يتكون من 2 alpha and 2 delta chains، وعندي أيضا كمية من hemoglobin F الفيتال hemoglobin، هذا طبعا بالintrauterine life with first 4 to 6 months after life يكون the prominent one but later on it is replaced by the adult hemoglobin، وهذا يتكون من 2 alpha and 2 gamma chains. شنو الاختلافات بين هذني الهيموغلوبينز؟ طبعا تختلف لأنه أنواع الجلوبين chains بيها تختلف، والجلوبين chains they are very important for determining the affinity of the hemoglobin to oxygen. لهذا راح نشوف إنه hemoglobin F مثلا يعني later on نشرح لكم إياها. hemoglobin F has higher affinity to oxygen so it will not deliver the oxygen easily to the tissues مو مثل hemoglobin A. This is the quaternary structure of hemoglobin. 4 hemogroups with an iron atom in the center, and each hemogroup is attached to a globin chain. Each 2 globin chains are identical. 2 alpha for example، يعني هذا ما دام 2 alpha 2 beta معناته هذا type. This is the adult hemoglobin. As we said, the type of the globin chain in the hemoglobin determines the oxygen affinity. For example, hemoglobin F has a higher affinity to oxygen than hemoglobin A. Now the relation between oxygen and hemoglobin best illustrated by what we call the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. شو نقصد بهذا الكيرف؟ It refers to the progressive increase in the percentage of hemoglobin bound with oxygen as the blood partial pressure of oxygen increase. So, when the blood partial pressure of oxygen is high, as is the situation in the pulmonary circulation or capillaries، شو راح يصير عندنا؟ The oxygen will bind with hemoglobin with high amount، يعني حيكون fully saturated with oxygen. When the O2, PO2 is low, as the situation in the tissues and venous circulation, oxygen is going to be released from hemoglobin. راح نشوف شلون. هذا المخطط هو ما يسمى بالأكسجين هيموغلوبين dissociation curve. طبعا انتم راح تاخذوه in details in the respiratory unit. احنا هنا بس راح نركز على الأشياء اللي تسوي لي ب shifting to the right and shifting to the left. هنا هذا المخطط يربط لك الأكسجين hemoglobin saturation with oxygen with the partial pressure of oxygen. يعني on the x-axis I have the pressure of oxygen and on the y-axis I have the saturation of oxygen. العلاقة طبعا هي مو خطية، راح نشوف انه كل ما يزيد الأكسجين tension بهذا الاتجاه كل ما نفس الوقت شو راح يصير عندي زيادة بالساتوريشن، يعني كمية الهيموغلوبين bound to oxygen. okay. بحيث اني اوصل انه at pressure of تقريبا 28 50% من الهيموغلوبين راح يكون saturated. 50% من الهيموغلوبين راح يكون saturated. من اوصل اني تقريبا pressure of 90 around 90 100% تقريبا من الهيموغلوبين راح يكون saturation. هذا وين نشوفه؟ هذا وين راح نشوفه؟ بال arterial circulation of the lung. هذا راح نشوفه بالفينوس circulation هنا. هاي العلاقة هي قلنا مو خطية sigmoid in shape، وطبعا اكو عوامل تأثر عليها ممكن تخلي هذا الكيرف ينحرف من مكانه شكله الطبيعي هذا، يا اما to the left بهذا الاتجاه يا اما to the right بهذا الاتجاه. الفيفر، acidosis، increase in the concentration of 2,3 diphosphoglycerate اللي هو موجود مركب موجود داخل خلايا الدم الحمراء، هذا كله يسوي لي shifting of the curve to the right. While hypothermia, alkalosis or reduced in this compound to 3-DPG will cause a left shift of the oxygen dissociation curve. سألون سؤال وشنو يعني إذا صار عندي right shift or left shift؟ لا، هاي تأثر على أنه شقد الجسم راح يستلم. يعني مثلا شلون خلينا نوصفها أنه الهيموغلوبين من يصير عندي left shift it will strongly bind to oxygen, decreasing its delivery to the tissues. يعني عم يزيد المشكلة. So left shift in the oxygen dissociation curve means that the oxygen will bind more strongly, reducing its delivery to the tissues. وحكينا على factors that can lead to this left shift: hypothermia, alkalosis, or reduction in the concentration of 2,3-DPG. ولا ننسى انه we have certain types of hemoglobin مثل hemoglobin F هو اصلا الافينيتي مالته عاليه ويتشلب بالاكسجين, and so it when hemoglobin F not easily release oxygen from it to the tissues. Okay, while a right shift in the oxygen dissociation curve means that the oxygen will be less avidly bind, مو نفس strength, مو قوي كلش binding, so it will be easily released to the tissues. And we have certain factors that causes this right shift, like for example fever, acidosis, or increase in the concentration of 2,3-DPG. طبعا هذا نعتبره مثل regulator or modulator compound present inside the red blood cells. زيادته ونقصانه كلش ممكن تأثر على the degree of binding of hemoglobin to oxygen. نرجع للكيرف. Relationship between saturation of oxygen and the partial pressure of oxygen inside the blood. Whenever we have increase in the tension, there will be increase in the saturation. تقريبا at the venous circulation when the pressure of oxygen 28, I have 50% saturation, while in the arterial circulation when the pressure is about 90, I will have 100% saturation. Certain factors are going to pull this curve either to the right or to the left. For example, fever, acidosis, or increase in the compound 2,3-diphosphoglycerate are going to cause a right shift, making oxygen more easily delivered to the tissues, while hypothermia, alkalosis, or reduction in the compound 2,3-DPG are going to cause a left shift in the oxygen dissociation curve and causes more strongly binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin and less delivery to the tissues. Now, our final subject in this lecture will be the lifespan and the destruction of the red blood cells. As we said previously, the red blood cells does not have a nucleus. هي ما عندها nucleus, so it cannot synthesize any enzyme or a compound or any component. هي تعتمد على ما مخزون وموجود بها. Once it is released, it cannot produce anything. It will depend on what is stored and the enzymes that are present in it, and continue to circulate until it reaches its half-life اللي هو تقريبا قد 120 days. The red blood cells that are old or effete نسميها يعني انتهى عمرها, they are destroyed by what? By the macrophages of the liver and the spleen and the bone marrow اللي نسميها reticuloendothelial system cells. Since the cell has no nucleus, the metabolism gradually is going to deteriorate, and the enzymes are going to degrade it, and they are not replaced because the cells cannot replace them, so the cells become non-viable. صار عندي destruction مثل ما قلنا بالmacrophages of the liver, the spleen, the bone marrow of the reticuloendothelial cells after 120 days. ايش راح يصير؟ شلون راح يأثر لنا هذا الدستركشن؟ شلون راح تتم عملية تحطيم واللي هي normal physiological process in our body that continue to happen daily. طبعا الجسم يحاول يستفيد من كل شيء. recycling of the components راح يصير عندنا بحيث ما نخسر شيء. So when احنا قلنا mainly it contains hemoglobin, فإذا mainly I'm going to talk about hemoglobin شلون راح يصير ب degradation. The heme portion of hemoglobin, الهيم اللي هو قلنا porphyrin ring with an iron atom in its center. أول شيء iron is very precious, كلش غالي وعزيز, so it's going to be taken by a protein carrier نسميه transferrin in the plasma. It's going to take the iron from those destructed red blood cells when يودي mainly to the marrow, يرجع مرتب لخلي المارو, to the erythroblast, to be reused for the synthesis of a new hemoglobin and a new red blood cells. So the iron is going to be taken by the plasma transferrin mainly to the marrow erythroblast to be reused for the synthesis of a new red blood cells. البورتوبورفارين ring ايش راح يصير بيه؟ It's going to be broken down into bilirubin نسميه unconjugated bilirubin that's going to circulate to the liver where it's going to be conjugated with glucuronides and then excreted through the bile into the duodenum. يمشي ينزل لجوا, it will be converted into stercobilinogen and stercobilin and excreted in the feces. هي هاي يعني ما أعرف إذا أنتم ماخذين البايل cycle, the indirect bilirubin and the direct bilirubin. This is the main pathway bilirubin that results from the breaking down of the porphyrin ring. يروح للليفر يصير بيه conjugation with a compound نسميها glucuronide يتحول إلى ما يسمى conjugated bilirubin. هذا ينفرز عن طريق البايل وين البايل يفتح بالدودنم to be converted later on into stercobilinogen and stercobilin that is excreted in the feces. And some of the stercobilinogen and stercobilin are also reabsorbed and excreted in the kidney as urobilinogen and urobilin. The globin chains are also broken down to amino acids and they are reutilized for general protein synthesis in the body. هم نستفاد من عندها تتحطم إلى amino acids وتروح للبروتين synthesis of the different types of proteins in our body. إذا هسه نقدر نتخيل إنه أني من حيصير عندي excessive destruction of the red blood cells as it happens in hemolytic anemia راح نحكي عليها بعدين later on بالمحاضرات الجاية. أتوقع راح يصير عندي جوندس إنه البيليروبين زيادته الإندايركت بيليروبين تسبب لما يسمى بالأبوصفار أو الجوندس. So this is the link between hemolytic anemia. I'm going to have excessive breaking down of portoporphyrin and increase in the amount of bilirubin, indirect bilirubin, and jaundice. So in hemolytic anemia, the indirect bilirubin is elevated and the patient suffers from jaundice due to the excessive destruction of the red blood cells. Thank you for your listening.